Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The History of Medicine, a Very Short Introduction by William Bynum, narrated by Jonathan Cowley. Publisher's Note: this audiobook refers to figures included in the print and ebook editions of the book. Introduction: The Kinds of Medicine. This is a short book on a very big subject. I have tried to provide a general framework for understanding the history of medicine since the ancient Greeks established what can be called the Western medical tradition. I present my history through a typology of the kinds of medicine. These are summarized in the following table and expounded in the first 5 chapters. The 5 kinds of medicine in Figure 1, bedside, library, hospital, community, and laboratory, represent different goals of doctors as well as reflecting the differing sites in which they work. Although their appearance allows a roughly chronological narrative, these kinds of medicine are cumulative. Bedside medicine, beginning with the Hippocratics, still has resonances in modern primary care, and the library medicine of the Middle Ages is relevant to the information explosion that characterizes the modern medical world, and not, of course, simply the medical one. In the 19th century, hospital medicine was in one sense bedside medicine writ large, with new diagnostic and therapeutic tools and the medical expertise we expect from the modern hospital. Medicine in the community encompasses the environmental infrastructure of clean water, waste disposal, vaccination programs, health and safety in our chosen workplaces, along with the analysis of disease patterns and their relationships to diet, habits, or exposure to agents in the environment. Laboratory medicine takes place mostly in the laboratory and may be translated into better drugs and understanding of bodily mechanisms that can improve diagnosis or treatment. These historical categories are thus still vibrant ones, and they allow a way of thinking about medical history that still resonates with today's citizens who are also taxpayers, consumers of healthcare, and beneficiaries of public health strategies. These kinds of medicine provide both the broad headings for contemporary health budgets and, especially within the American scene, where special interest advocacy influences health spending, the identity of interest groups. Primary care, hospital services, public health, biomedical research, and information creation and provision. Among major health demands, there is not much else that a modern health minister need bother about. The trouble, of course, is that these categories in some sense compete with each other, since health budgets are always limited. The more you spend on research, the less you may have for hospital staffing or public health, and vice versa. The categories overlap historically. In their own ways, the ancient Greeks and Romans developed the whole range of approaches to health-related problems. They tried to prevent diseases within the community, had simple institutions to care for slaves and soldiers, needed places where medical texts were gathered together, tried to add to medical knowledge through inquiry and, of course, cared for patients at the bedside. But the modern categories of hospital, community, and laboratory medicine emerged in their current forms within the 19th century, and are what we think of as modernity. In the final chapter, I use the typology to frame a brief account of major developments in the 20th and 21st centuries when the kinds of medicine have become intertwined. The way I have structured this short account privileges the Western medical tradition, which dominates health consumption and expenditure in the West and is a major force everywhere. There are many other ways in which historians have constructed the story, but I have chosen this one because I believe it has a historically coherent form and is useful in introducing the subject to curious listeners. Were I submitting this manuscript to a medical journal, I would be required to state any competing interests which might color how I have interpreted my data. I have been a medical historian for almost 4 decades, but I also trained in medicine during the golden age that is identified in Chapter 6. My medical education has certainly influenced the way I interpret medicine's past, but I have tried here to avoid either the old-fashioned Whiggism, which viewed all history as progress and a series of steps leading inevitably to the present, or the newer version, which has substituted contemporary moral values for intellectual ones and thereby castigates the sexism, racism, and other isms of our forebears. It seems to me that those in the past who had access have generally sought the medical care that was on offer, and believed that there were good doctors and bad doctors. They wanted a good doctor to take care of them. So do we. What has changed is what constitutes a good doctor. Chapter 1. Medicine at the Bedside. Hippocrates and all that. Hippocrates has become the favoured father for healers of all stripes. Homeopathists find in the Hippocratic writings the roots of their doctrines. Naturopaths, chiropractors, herbalists, and osteopaths invoke him as the founder of the ideals that underlie their own approaches to health, disease, and healing. So do modern hospital consultants, many of whom would have repeated his oath, or a version of it, when they took their medical degrees. The reasons for this curious state of affairs can be found in history. For the one thing, the historical Hippocrates is sufficiently shadowy to allow a multiplicity of interpretations to be hung from him. He is shadowy, but real. He lived on the island of Kos, off the coast of present-day Turkey, from about 460 BCE to 370 BCE. This makes him a bit older than Plato, Aristotle, and the other cosmopolitan creators of classical Greek culture centered in Athens. His antiquity makes the survival of so many Hippocratic works that much more remarkable. People save what they particularly value. Besides where and approximately when he lived, we know only a little more. He practiced medicine, took pupils for a fee, and had a son. He also achieved a fair degree of fame, since Plato mentioned him. Whether he actually wrote any of the works attributed to him is less clear. He certainly did not write them all, for they were composed over about 2 centuries by various unknown hands. This means that the Hippocratic corpus, the 60 or so works and fragments that survive, contain much inconsistency and many points of view. These Hippocratic writings cover many aspects of medicine and surgery, as well as diagnostics, therapeutics, and disease prevention. The Hippocratics offered advice on diet and other aspects of healthy living, and there is a particularly influential treatise on the role of the environment in health and disease. There were thus many Hippocratic stances, and our Hippocratic medicine is a historical construct, achieved by picking out certain themes and theories and putting them together in a framework that was unknown during the centuries of the composition of the treatises. Amidst this multiplicity, however, there is one strand that runs through the whole corpus and makes Hippocrates so attractive to so many modern healers. Hippocratic medicine is holistic. The Hippocratic approach is always to the whole patient, and the modern yearning for a holistic medicine finds a natural resting place there. Despite its admirable positive characteristics, this holism was also rooted in cultural values widespread in Greek society. The ancient Greeks disliked dissection of human bodies. They performed no autopsies to determine the cause of death, and Greek doctors taught no deep anatomy to their apprentices. There were no medical schools in the modern sense of the term. Students learned through their masters, and what they knew was surface anatomy and a shrewd sense of looking carefully at their patients for signs suggesting the likely cause of the disease, that is, its prognosis, and especially whether the patient was likely to recover or not. That there were no hospitals meant that the bedside of this chapter's title was literally the patient's, in his or her own home. These structures of ancient Greek medicine make it the prototype of modern primary care. The Hippocratic doctor needed to know his patient thoroughly. What his social, economic, and familial circumstances were, how he lived, what he usually ate and drank, whether he had travelled or not, whether he was a slave or free, and what his tendencies to disease were. The theoretical reasons for this were embedded in the Hippocratic writings, of which more later. If the holism attracts modern complementary healers to the Greek, there are other attributes to Hippocratic medicine that resonate within contemporary scientific medicine. The most important of these is its underlying naturalism. The medical systems of the ancient Near East, Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Babylonia, combined theology and healing. The priest-physician a common trope. Disease was widely assumed to be the result of divine displeasure, transgressions of various kinds, or magical forces. Diagnosis might involve prayer, interpreting animal entrails, or determining how the patient had transgressed. This mix of magico-religious medicine was also part of the Greek landscape during the Hippocratic period. Healing temples dedicated to the Greek god of medicine, Asclepius, were dotted over the Greek sphere of influence, including, ironically, a famous one in Hippocrates' own backyard, Kos itself. The most substantial one was on the mainland at Epidaurus, the extensive remains of which are still extant. These temples were in the hands of resident priests who received patients and interpreted illness on the basis of dreams that patients reported to them. The dreams were probably affected by the presence of holy snakes, which undoubtedly disturbed sleep patterns. By sloughing its skin, the snake was an example of renewal, and a prominent part of the caduceus, symbol of the Greek god of healing. Curiously, Asclepius and the rod, both redolent of magic and religion, have been naturalized as an emblem of modern medicine. These healing temples were an important part of Greek medical care, but the values they embodied had little impact on the Hippocratic corpus. The treatises that form it assume that disease has a natural cause, but only once does a Hippocratic author explicitly attack supernatural explanations of disease. This occurs at the beginning of a treatise on epilepsy called The Sacred Disease in common Greek parlance. It was deemed sacred because epileptic attacks were dramatic, causing as they do a loss of consciousness, foaming at the mouth, relaxation of muscle, bladder and sphincter control, but also included psychological symptoms which sufferers could sometimes turn to their advantage. Alexander the Great and later Julius Caesar were powerful epileptics in antiquity. The opening sentences of The Sacred Disease have been interpreted as a clarion call for a complete naturalism within medicine. They are still compelling, written as they were more than 2 millennia ago. It is thus with regard to the disease called sacred. It appears to me to be no wise more divine nor more sacred than other diseases, but has a natural cause from which it originates like other affections. Men regard its nature and cause as divine from ignorance and wonder, because it is not at all like to other diseases. And this notion of divinity is kept up by their inability to comprehend it, and the simplicity of the mode by which it is cured, for men are freed from it by purifications and incantations. But if it is reckoned divine because it is wonderful, instead of one there are many diseases which would be sacred. It is significant that this stance is not irreligious, no wise more divine nor more sacred than other diseases, but couched within a framework that could offer an explanation within naturalist terms of the origins of this so-called sacred disease. The Hippocratic author goes on to offer such an explanation. Epilepsy is caused by blockage within the brain, so that the regular expulsion of phlegm is stopped, thereby producing malfunctioning of the brain and the dramatic symptoms of the epileptic seizure. 2 further implications are worth noting. First, this Hippocratic author located consciousness and other mental functions to the brain. And men ought to know that from nothing else but the brain come joys, delights, laughter and sports, and sorrows, griefs, despondency and lamentations. And by this, in an especial manner, we acquire wisdom and knowledge, and see and hear, and know what are foul and what are fair, what are bad and what are good, what are sweet and what unsavory. Some we discriminate by habit, and some we perceive by their utility. The centrality of the brain is of course now a commonplace in scientific thinking, but it was not so with the Greeks. Plato followed Hippocrates in viewing the brain as the seat of psychological activity, but Plato's pupil Aristotle believed that the heart is the center of emotion and other mental functions. After all, when we are anxious or in love, it is in the breast or heart, not the brain, that we experience such events. The heart, not the brain, beats faster when we are most alive. Besides, Aristotle, an experienced student of embryological development, noted that the first sign of life in the developing chick embryo was the motion within the primitive heart. Almost 2 millennia later, Shakespeare was to recall this old debate. Tell me, where is fancy bred, or in the heart or in the head? Despite our language, which still attributes much to the heart, Hippocrates and Plato won that debate. The second significant point to tease out of this treatise relates to the Hippocratic cause of epilepsy, blocked phlegm. Phlegm might seem the sign of a common cold to us, but it was for the Hippocratics one of 4 humours, which were constitutive of health and disease, and thus at the heart of Hippocratic physiology and pathology. Although humoral doctrine was not contained in all of the Hippocratic treatises, it can be pieced together and was interpreted by the other giant of ancient Greek medicine, Galen, AD 129 to circa 210, as central to medical theory. Galen gave humoral medicine such prestige that it dominated medical thinking until the 18th century. Humours, the complete system. The 4 humours were blood, yellow bile, black bile and phlegm, and as can be seen from the schematic diagram in Figure 2, they constituted a formidable framework for understanding health and disease, and much else besides. They eventually embodied a theory of temperaments which provided a guide to human personality and susceptibility to disease. The properties of the humours, heat, cold, dryness, moistness, offered a parallel reading of the course of diseases and of the stages of the individual life cycle. Each of the humours was also linked to one of the 4 elements, air, fire, earth, water, which Greek natural philosophy posited as the constituents of all the things in the sublunary world. Below the moon, in our world, things change, grow old, and die. Above the moon, perfect circular motion was postulated as the norm, with stars made of a 5th element, the quintessence. Taken as a whole package, Greek humorism was the most powerful explanatory framework of health and disease available to doctors and laymen until scientific medicine began gradually to replace it during the 19th century. Bodily fluids and their effects are features that someone caring for a sick person notices. The skin becomes flushed when the sick person is febrile. People cough up phlegm or blood. Eyes water and noses run. The urine turns dark if there is jaundice or dehydration. The skin can become clammy, sweaty, or pale, and diarrhea or vomiting may be prominent features of illness. Greek cultural prohibitions against dissecting human bodies meant that the Hippocratics had relatively little knowledge of deep anatomy, or it was inferred from animal dissections or knowledge acquired through preparation of animals for eating. This did not seem to bother the Hippocratics very much, although Galen later tried very hard to provide anatomical knowledge, largely through dissecting animals. Humoral medicine does not require all that much knowledge of anatomy, since the operative elements are the bodily fluids, not the solids. Each of the humours was identified with a bodily organ, however. phlegm with the brain, blood with the heart, yellow bile with the liver, and black bile with the spleen. Further, in the surgical treatises of the Hippocratic writings, these doctors also discussed the setting of fractures, reduction of dislocated joints, wound treatment, and simple operations for various specific conditions. Surgical work, then as now, requires a much more focused orientation on a particular area of the body. But Hippocratic medicine remained holistic and preoccupied with interpreting the changes of the humours. Humouralism brought with it two related and enduring themes within Western medicine: balance and moderation. The Hippocratics viewed health as the result of a sound balance of the humours. Imbalance, too much or too little of one or more of them, or an imperfect quality, often described as a corruption of one of them, produced disease. The body was sometimes regarded as a kind of oven, with cooking metaphors prominent in Hippocratic descriptions of disease. Excretions in disease, pus, sweat, expectorated phlegm, concentrated urine, vomitus, diarrhea, were interpreted as the products of natural defense mechanisms. The body often cooked or concocted corrupt or excess humours to enable the better removal of the surfeit or the peccant humours and restore a balance. The Hippocratics interpreted this bedside observation of the body getting rid of humours as evidence of what they called the vix mediatrix naturae, the healing power of nature. This doctrine has long been debated within medicine, and it was codified in the 19th century with the concept of self-limited disease. A powerful modern medicine is able easily to accommodate it. Most disease, treated or untreated, is self-limited. Treating the symptoms of a cold, for example, may make one feel better, but it never really touches the cause, which in due course the body generally deals with. Every doctor knows this, but they also know that the prescription that makes the patient feel better is often interpreted as curative. Post hoc, ergo propter hoc. After, therefore, because of. A lot of clinical medicine has always relied on this logical fallacy. The Hippocratics were more modest, and the doctrine of the healing power of nature gave rise to two of their most important aphorisms. Natural forces are the healers of disease, and as to diseases, make a habit of two things: to help, or at least do no harm. Therapy was thus aimed primarily at assisting the patient's body do its natural work. Some of their procedures jar with modern sentiment. Bloodletting, for example, had a rational basis, since local inflammation or the flush of fever was easily interpreted as evidence that the body had too much blood and therefore needed aid in ridding itself of it. Bloodletting is one of the oldest and most persistent therapies, and the one most often held up as evidence of the crude barbarity of medicine until the modern period. It continued to be a mainstay of therapeutics until the mid-19th century, and was abandoned only gradually and reluctantly by rank-and-file practitioners. Patients often demanded it, and many of them reported being helped by having blood let, sometimes so much that the doctor stopped only when the patient was on the point of fainting. As another Hippocratic aphorism put it, for extreme diseases, extreme strictness of treatment is most efficacious, often made more pungent. Dangerous diseases require dangerous remedies. In general, however, humoral therapy was mixed and included diet, exercise, massage, and other modalities that were aimed at the individual needs of the individual patient. It was this holistic individualism that was the core feature of their medical practice. Although Hippocratic writings contain descriptions of many diseases to which we can give modern labels, they never separated the disease from the individual sufferer. Thus, although we can find accounts of diseases we might call consumption, tuberculosis, stroke, malaria, epilepsy, hysteria, and dysentery, these are presented as events that happened to individual people. They used these experiences to come to generalizations about how to deal with these diseases, presented as aphorisms and what we would now call clinical pearls. Their humoral explanatory framework always encouraged them to tailor particular treatments to unique cases. The Hippocratics were also acutely aware that diseases often sweep through a community, affecting the old and young, rich and poor, thin and corpulent, male and female. Just those attributes that at the bedside they strove to take into account when making a diagnosis and recommending a therapeutic regimen. In two particularly influential treatises, a series of books on epidemics, and one entitled Airs, Waters, Places, the Hippocratic writers offered reflections about these wider aspects of disease. Airs, Waters, Places is essentially the foundation statement of Western environmentalism, especially as it relates to health and disease. It offered advice on where to build one's house, well-drained soil protected from chilling winds, and analyzed the health of communities in terms of the environmental factors that impinged on their inhabitants. Like most medical and biological thinking until the late 19th century, it espoused what is now called, anachronistically, Lamarckianism. That is, the Hippocratics believed that environmental factors could change the basic characteristics of human beings, skin color, body shape, and so on, and that these changes could be passed on to offspring. This is an optimistic philosophy of human malleability, consonant with the general Hippocratic confidence that their therapeutic regimen had much to offer to its patients. At the same time, their writings are full of occasions when experience taught that the disease was so far advanced or serious that there was little to be done. Wider Hippocratic reverberations. The humours provided a theoretical framework that lasted. We still use the idea of the temperament in casual speech, a naturally sanguine person, generally melancholic, and the hot, cold, wet, dry axes of the humours regulate how we see common acute complaints. Popular belief has it that we catch colds by going out without our hats on or getting our feet wet. Doctors who ought to know better fall in with popular disease conceptions about the nature and treatment of colds, partly because that is what patients expect, partly because it saves time in the patient-doctor encounter, partly because doctors, too, are all too human. More recently, Darwinian medicine has used the Hippocratic Vix Mediatrix Naturae to question the treatment of symptoms. Is it better to suppress the cough or dry up the nasal secretions when they are part of a naturally evolved defense? Much of the Hippocratic legacy was actually transmitted to the West through the writings of Galen, who dominated medical thinking for more than a millennium. Galen saw himself as extending and completing the framework of the Hippocratics. We know much more about him than any other doctor of antiquity. More words of his survive than any other ancient writer, medical or otherwise, and his works are laced with autobiographical snippets. He wrote about all aspects of medicine, diagnosis, therapy, regimen, and the philosophy of medicine. He codified the Hippocratic doctrine of the humours, but also consolidated an experimental dimension to medicine. Whereas the Hippocratics were content with careful observation, Galen went much further, offering anatomical and physiological accounts of what happened in health and disease. He was big on ego strength and seemed to assume that his was the last word on virtually everything. He cannot be blamed that most doctors for more than 1,000 years agreed with him. Humoralism served Galen very well at the bedside, explaining disease, but he also developed a complicated physiology to explain normal bodily function, which relied on spirits, pneuma, rather than humours. Within his model, food was taken into the stomach, whence it was turned into chyle. This chyle went to the liver via the portal vein, where it was converted into blood suffused with natural pneuma. Some of this blood then was conveyed to the heart. Part of the blood from the heart went to the lungs to nourish this essential organ. Other portions of the heart's blood passed through invisible pores from the right to the left ventricle, where it mixed with vital pneuma.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?